In the cool, shaded corners of an ancient marketplace, where the morning sun painted long lines across cobblestone streets, the sound of commerce was not the roar of a stock exchange or the hum of machinery, but the soft, deliberate clink of gold coins passing from one weathered hand to another. Merchants leaned over tables laden with bolts of deep-dyed silk from faraway lands, fragrant heaps of cinnamon and cardamom, and jars of honey so clear they caught the light like molten amber. The air carried the mingled scents of baked bread, drying herbs, and warm dust rising from the ground. And everywhere, as if in harmony with the gentle murmur of voices, came the unmistakable chime of gold, that small, resonant sound that could open gates, seal agreements, and command trust across continents.
Gold was not merely a metal here. It was a promise, a weight in the palm that needed no translation, no signature, no witness. A merchant from the valleys of the Indus could offer it to a trader from the deserts of Arabia, and both would understand its value without a single word in common. Long before paper money or banking systems spanned the globe, gold was the language of wealth, universal, enduring, and silent. There were practical reasons for this, of course. Gold does not rust. It does not decay. It can be melted, reshaped, and carried without fear of it losing its essence. While the iron tools of a century ago may crumble into flakes of brown dust, gold remains, its surface still glowing as if it has captured a fragment of the sun itself.
The first societies to use gold as a measure of wealth did not stumble upon the idea by accident. The Lydians, in what is now Western Turkey, are often credited with minting the first true gold coins around the 7th century BCE. Before them, gold had been worked into jewelry, ornaments, and religious offerings, symbols of beauty and reverence. But the Lydians took a decisive step forward. By stamping gold with marks of weight and authenticity, they transformed it from a static ornament into a tool of trade. A small disc of stamped gold could pass from hand to hand without the need for scales or negotiation over purity. Trust was transferred to the mark, and through that trust, markets grew. From Lydia, the concept spread like the roots of trade themselves. The Romans adopted gold coins with the same enthusiasm they showed for aqueducts, roads, and law. The aureus, and later the solidus, became symbols not only of payment, but of the reach and power of the Roman state. Soldiers were paid in gold, and the empire's taxes and tributes flowed back into its coffers as shining streams of coin. In a world without wire transfers or printed banknotes, the movement of gold was the movement of empire itself. Centuries later, under the rule of the Islamic caliphates, gold would again assert its role as a unifier. The dinar, minted in lands stretching from Spain to Persia, was not only a stable currency, but also a bridge between cultures. Merchants traveling along the Silk Road could find a dinar accepted as easily in the markets of Damascus as in the ports of North Africa. Gold's ability to transcend borders made it the invisible architecture of the medieval economy, supporting trade routes that crossed deserts, seas, and mountain passes. Why gold and not something else? That question echoes across history like the sound of a coin dropping into a chest. The answer lies partly in its physical properties. Other metals tarnish or corrode. Gold resists time. Other commodities like grain, salt, or cattle have intrinsic value, but are tied to local needs and can spoil or perish. Gold, in contrast, is compact wealth. A fortune could be carried in a pouch no larger than a man's hand, and in times of danger, wars, famine, political collapse, that portability could mean survival. In many ways, gold was the ancient world's equivalent of today's safe haven investments. Just as modern investors turned to gold in times of market instability, ancient rulers and merchants relied on it when uncertainty loomed. A failed harvest might cause the value of grain to plummet in one region, or the collapse of a dynasty might render a local currency worthless. But gold could still be exchanged, still hold trust, still buy passage, shelter, or influence. The power gold held over societies was not purely practical, it was deeply symbolic. Kings wore crowns of gold not merely to display wealth,
but to embody divine authority. Religious temples lined their altars with it, seeing in its incorruptibility a reflection of eternity itself. Even in cultures that did not use gold as currency, it was often reserved for the most sacred or honored uses. In this way, gold became not just a means of payment, but an expression of value in its purest form, both material and spiritual. The stability it brought, however, was never absolute. Wars could drain treasuries, mines could run dry, ships heavy with gold could sink in sudden storms. But even when individual fortunes vanished, the metal itself remained somewhere in the world to be recovered, reminted, and put back into circulation. It was, in a sense, immortal.
Imagine being a merchant in those days, standing in a crowded bazaar, feeling the weight of a few gold coins in your pouch, aware that those small pieces could buy you a camel load of spices, secure a passage on a merchant ship, or open the doors of an inn in a distant city. That same coin, if carried across 1,000 miles, might be accepted without question by a stranger whose language you did not speak. There was a kind of magic in that, a magic born not of illusion, but of trust forged over centuries. This trust in gold shaped more than commerce. It influenced politics, war, and even the mapping of the world. Empires rose on the back of gold, both in the literal sense of funding their armies and in the symbolic sense of projecting wealth and stability. Treaties were sealed in gold, ransoms paid, debts forgiven or enforced. The flow of gold could elevate a city from a small trading post to a capital of influence, just as its loss could plunge a nation into obscurity. In this way, gold's story is woven into the story of human ambition. It is the gleam at the heart of exploration, from the caravans that crossed the Sahara to the ships that sailed west into uncharted oceans in search of new mines. It is the weight behind the decisions of kings and councils. And it is the quiet, enduring witness to every transaction where value must be made real, tangible, and lasting. Yet gold's reign as the supreme measure of wealth was not without challengers. Over time, new resources emerged, each with their own power to shape economies and destinies. Some were born of necessity, others of technological innovation, and still others of sheer abundance in the right place at the right time. These rivals would not dethrone gold entirely, for even today it retains a place of honor in the vaults of nations, but they would change the balance of wealth in ways the merchants of Lydia or Rome could scarcely have imagined. And so, as empires rose and fell, other resources began to rival gold in shaping the flow of wealth. Salt, grain, two simple commodities, so common in appearance that they might seem unworthy of mention beside gold's brilliance. Yet in their time, they were worth their weight in wealth. In many places, they were wealth. To understand why, you must imagine a world without refrigeration, without trucks and trains, without vast networks of global shipping that can bring food from another hemisphere. In that world, preservation is survival. Salt is not just a seasoning, it is life itself. The difference between a store of meat or fish that will feed a village through winter and one that will rot within days. A steady supply of grain is not just a convenience, it is the very foundation of stability, the base upon which armies march, cities grow, and governments endure. In ancient Egypt, grain was as much a currency as any coin. The Nile's yearly flooding was a kind of divine accounting, depositing rich silt on the fields and determining the abundance or scarcity of the harvest. The state collected grain in great storehouses, not merely as tax, but as a reserve of wealth. Those reserves could be used to pay workers, to feed soldiers, or to trade with neighboring lands. Grain was portable in its own way, carried in sacks along river barges, and like gold, it could be measured, divided, and exchanged. The Roman world understood this as well. The phrase annona, referring to the grain supply of Rome, was almost synonymous with the stability of the empire itself. Grain from the provinces, Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, flowed into the capital not only to feed its people, but to maintain political order. A hungry populace was a dangerous one, and emperors who failed to provide bread often found themselves facing riots. In this way, grain functioned as both an economic and a political currency. Salt's role was even more fascinating. The very word salary comes from the Latin salarium, a payment given to Roman soldiers that at times included or was based upon salt. This was not mere symbolism. Salt was essential for preserving food during campaigns, for treating wounds, and for maintaining health in hot climates where sweat drained the body of vital minerals. A man could not march without salt any more than he could march without water.
These were currencies not because they were shiny or beautiful, but because they answered the most urgent needs of survival. In times of famine or drought, grain was not simply valuable, it was priceless. In times of abundance, both grain and salt were stockpiled, like a hedge against the cruelty of the seasons. Kings and rulers who controlled these commodities held power in a way that gold could not always match. A gold coin could not feed you if there was no bread to buy, but a sack of grain could feed an army and win a war. It is easy to think of these as primitive forms of wealth, to imagine them as stepping stones toward more sophisticated systems of currency. But in truth, they were the foundation, the reason why more abstract forms of value could exist at all. Without the basic needs secured, without a way to preserve food to ensure supply in lean years, no society could spare the thought, labor, or energy for higher ambitions. The exchange of salt and grain also shaped trade networks long before the concept of a global economy. The salt roads of Europe, the grain barges of the Nile, the camel caravans of the Sahara, these were the arteries through which life and commerce flowed. A city without access to these commodities could not grow beyond its immediate surroundings. A city that controlled them could rise to dominance over entire regions. Imagine being a merchant in a market where the air is dry and hot, the dust clinging to your skin, and before you lies a pyramid of salt blocks stacked like the building stones of a white fortress. You know that each block can be traded far away for goods you have never seen or for coin that will pay for the next journey. Beside you, another trader stands before great clay jars filled with grain, the sound of kernels shifting like dry rain as the jars are sealed. Around you, the noise of barter rises, salt for spices, grain for pottery, wool for dried fish, the constant dance of exchange that binds communities together. In these places, wealth was not an abstract number written in a ledger, but something you could touch, taste, and see. It was the loaf of bread that fed your family, the salted fish that would keep through the winter, the storehouse full of grain that meant you could face the coming year without fear. The influence of these commodities extended into law and governance. In some ancient states, taxes could be paid in grain or salt rather than coin, reflecting their central role in the economy. The Inca Empire in South America, though far from the gold and salt trades of Africa and Eurasia, used stored maize and potatoes as both a tribute and a state reserve, ensuring that even in bad harvest years, the population could be sustained.
Even today, when financial markets can send trillions of dollars flashing across the globe in milliseconds, disruptions in the grain supply can shake entire nations. The same is true for salt and certain regions where it remains vital to industry, health, and food preservation. Wars have been fought over both, just as they have been fought over gold, oil, and other resources. In this way, salt and grain occupy a unique place in the history of wealth. They remind us that the things we often take for granted, a pinch of salt, a slice of bread, were once treasures worth risking a journey across deserts or a voyage across seas. They remind us that before wealth could be measured in numbers, it was measured in survival. And as history moved forward, new commodities would join gold, salt, and grain in the theater of economic power. Some would be luxurious, desired for beauty and rarity. Others would be purely practical, prized for their ability to fuel machines, armies, and entire nations. Among these was a set of goods so fragrant, so coveted, that they became known as maritime gold, linking continents in a network of trade that spanned oceans and changed the course of history. The desert roads that once carried salt and the grain barges that drifted down calm rivers were not the only arteries of wealth. As ships grew stronger, as maps became more reliable, and horizons less mysterious, another set of trade routes began to shimmer into focus, not across the sand, but across the sea. The oceans, vast and restless, had long been a barrier, a wall of uncertainty separating civilizations. But with time, they became the greatest highway of all, carrying goods so valuable they could tilt the balance of power between nations. At the heart of this maritime revolution were two treasures: spices and silver. To a modern mind, spices might seem like an odd foundation for an empire's wealth. After all, in most kitchens today, pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg sit quietly in glass jars, inexpensive and easily replaced. But in the centuries before refrigeration, before the industrial food supply, spices were not a simple luxury. They were a way to preserve meat, to mask the taste of food that had traveled far or been stored too long. They were also intoxicating in their rarity, scents and flavors from lands that most people could barely imagine.
Pepper from India, cloves from the Moluccas, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from the Banda Islands. These were not just condiments, they were mysteries made tangible, each one carrying the fragrance of a distant world. A handful of nutmeg could cost as much as a cow. A small bag of pepper could pay a month's rent in a European city. And their value was not merely in the kitchens of the wealthy. Spices were also medicine, perfume, and preservative. In a sense, they were an early form of global luxury branding, rare, exotic, and deeply desired. But the spice trade was more than just a market for flavors. It was a spark that ignited exploration itself. European powers, frustrated by the long overland routes controlled by middlemen, merchants in the Middle East who held the gateway between Asia and Europe, sought direct access to the sources. This desire for spices sent ships south around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, west across the uncharted Atlantic, and into the dangerous waters of the Pacific. It was no coincidence that Christopher Columbus, when he sailed under the flag of Spain, was looking for a faster route to the spice-rich East Indies. His miscalculation in distance brought him instead to the Americas, and with it, a discovery that would reshape the economics of the entire world: silver.
The arrival of Europeans in the New World unleashed a torrent of silver unlike anything seen before. The Spanish struck rich veins in places like Potosi in modern-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico. Potosi, in particular, became a name synonymous with vast wealth, its mines yielding thousands of tons of silver over the centuries. The city's riches were so legendary that the phrase "worth a Potosi" entered the Spanish language as a synonym for unimaginable value. Silver was to the maritime age what gold had been to the ancient world. A currency that traveled far, was easily divisible and universally recognized. But there was a crucial difference. While gold remained relatively scarce, the influx of silver from the Americas was unprecedented in scale. Ship after ship crossed the Atlantic, their holds heavy with bars and coins, all destined for the treasuries of Spain, and from there to the markets of Europe and beyond. Yet silver's journey did not end in Europe. Much of it, in fact, continued its voyage eastward. The Spanish discovered that China, under the Ming Dynasty, had a voracious appetite for silver. The Chinese economy, vast and complex, has shifted to a silver-based tax system, creating enormous demand for the metal. In exchange, China exported silk, porcelain, and tea, goods equally coveted in Europe.
Here is where spices and silver intertwined in the grand choreography of maritime trade. European ships, particularly those of Spain and Portugal, sailed from the Americas laden with silver, stopped at ports in Asia to purchase spices, silk, and porcelain, and returned home to sell these treasures at enormous profit. Other ships, particularly from the Dutch and English East India companies, focused more directly on the spice routes themselves, building fortified trading posts and even seizing entire islands to secure their monopolies. The control of spice-producing territories became a deadly serious game. In the Banda Islands, for example, the Dutch secured exclusive rights to nutmeg by force, even massacring or deporting much of the local population to maintain their monopoly. Spices were wealth in their purest, most concentrated form.
small enough to be stored in a single chest, valuable enough to fund fleets, armies, and palaces. Silver, meanwhile, became the lubricant that kept the machinery of this global trade moving. Without silver to offer as payment, the European powers could not have sustained their purchases from Asia, where their manufactured goods held little appeal. Silver was the bridge that connected the riches of the New World to the treasures of the Old. The implications of this new maritime wealth were profound. Economically, it marked the first truly global trading system, one in which goods, currency, and people moved in an unbroken circuit around the world. Politically, it shifted the centers of power. Nations with strong navies and overseas colonies rose to prominence, while those bound to land-based trade routes saw their influence wane. Socially, it introduced new luxuries and flavors into daily life in Europe, changing diets, fashions, and even architecture. The great spice warehouses of Amsterdam and London, the ornate silver tableware in aristocratic homes, the exotic porcelains displayed in parlors, these were all visible symbols of the invisible web of maritime trade. Yet, there was a darker side to this wealth. The hunger for silver and spices fueled colonization, war, and exploitation. Indigenous populations were displaced, enslaved, or forced into labor. The silver mines of Potosi were worked by thousands of indigenous laborers and African slaves under brutal conditions, many of whom perished from exhaustion, accidents, and the toxic effects of mercury used in refining. And while spices enriched European kitchens, they often brought ruin to the lands that produced them. Silver and spices together represent a turning point in the story of wealth, the moment when the sea became the dominant stage for economic power. The world was now connected in a way it had never been before, and the currents of the ocean carried not just ships, but the future of nations. But the oceans were not done transforming the world, for while spices eventually became less rare and the flow of silver began to slow, the mastery of maritime trade had laid the groundwork for another revolution, one powered not by sails and spices, but by engines and coal. And from that coal would come a new kind of wealth, one that would fuel the rise of factories, cities, and machines, and eventually pave the way for the black gold that would replace the yellow. It is the early 19th century, and the world is humming with a strange new rhythm. The creak of wooden carts and the slow heave of sailing ships are giving way to a deep, resonant chugging, the pulse of the steam engine. Steel tracks are being laid like metallic veins across continents, linking coal mines to ports, ports to factories, and factories to far-off markets. In this new age, wealth is no longer measured only by the glitter of gold coins in a merchant's chest. Power, and the fortunes that accompany it, are beginning to be stored in a very different form. The mastery of machines, the movement of goods at unprecedented speeds, and the raw materials that feed this mechanized hunger. Imagine walking into London's docks in the 1840s, where once caravans of spices or bales of silk would arrive slowly from the east, now vast iron steamships crowd the harbor, their towering funnels coughing out black plumes. Cargo is unloaded not over weeks, but in hours. Cotton from India, wheat from America, and timber from the Baltic are all flowing through these ports with a frequency and volume the medieval mind could never have conceived. The merchants who once built their fortunes on slow, seasonal trade are adapting or disappearing. In their place rise industrial magnates whose wealth is tied less to the possession of precious metals and more to the control of production, distribution, and the networks that carry goods to a growing urban population. Gold, of course, still gleams in the background. It remains the measure of national reserves, the anchor for currencies, the reassuring standard of value in times of uncertainty. But something subtle is shifting. For the first time in centuries, economic might is beginning to lean not on the scarcity of a metal dug from the earth, but on the capacity to harness energy and shape the physical world. The currency of power is expanding to include coal seams, steel mills, and shipping lines. The great merchant banks still keep their vaults filled with gold bars, but their true influence lies in financing railways, underwriting steamship companies, and speculating in the industrial enterprises that are redrawing the world's economic map. This shift does not happen overnight. For decades, gold and industrial wealth coexist, often reinforcing each other. Railways funded by gold-backed bonds carry goods that generate profits, which are then reinvested into more industrial ventures. But beneath the surface, a quiet erosion of gold's singular role is underway. A gold coin can still buy you a meal or a fine garment, but it cannot move 1,000 tons of coal from Wales to London overnight. The mechanics of trade are no longer defined solely by what a nation owns, but by what it can do and how quickly it can do it. And yet, for all its innovation, the industrial era is also laying the groundwork for the next great economic shift. Steam and steel are powered by coal, but the world is beginning to notice another fuel, thicker, darker, and far more energy-dense. Oil is still a curiosity in most places, a nuisance seeping from the ground in Pennsylvania or Baku. But engineers and visionaries are already imagining its potential. The internal combustion engine is on the horizon. Ships might one day run without the constant feeding of coal into furnaces. Factories might be powered by this strange liquid. And in that possibility lies a subtle foreshadowing. The day will come when even coal, the reigning champion of industrial energy, will be dethroned. Imagine, as this segment closes, standing in a railway station in 1880. The iron tracks stretch toward the horizon. The air smells of steam, oil, and metal. The ticket clerk counts coins, gold sovereigns still gleaming, but the real wealth is moving outside, on those steel rails. The great engines exhale clouds into the sky, pulling behind them not just cargo, but the momentum of an entire new economic order. In the world of wealth's long journey, the age of gold has met the age of industry. And beyond the horizon, something even more transformative is waiting.
The transition is already underway. Coal and steam have opened the door to a new kind of wealth, one measured in the mastery of movement and energy. But oil will step through that door, and when it does, it will not just replace coal, it will challenge gold itself for the title of wealth's ultimate anchor. The story, as we will soon see, is only beginning. Before oil became the beating heart of the modern economy, it was simply a curious, sticky substance that seeped from the ground in certain corners of the world. For centuries, it was known in various forms: bitumen for waterproofing boats in Mesopotamia, lamp fuel distilled from shale in parts of China, and a strange, thick liquid used in primitive medicinal remedies. Yet no one in those earlier ages could have foreseen that this dark fluid would one day surpass gold as the ultimate arbiter of wealth and power. Gold had been the treasure of kings and the symbol of stability, but oil was movement. Oil was fire captured in liquid form, capable of turning steel wheels, fueling great ships, and eventually powering machines that could change the very shape of nations. Imagine, for a moment, the world in the mid-19th century. The Industrial Revolution was already in full swing. Coal was the great powerhouse, driving steam engines, smelting iron, and fueling factories that churned day and night. Cities grew fat and smoky under coal's reign, and gold still served as the keeper of financial trust. But somewhere beneath the Earth's surface, silent reservoirs of crude oil lay in wait, storing millions of years of sunlight transformed into a potent, combustible liquid. And when humanity learned to extract it in vast quantities, the foundations of global economics began to shift in ways no monarch or banker could fully anticipate.
The real turning point came in 1859 in a small, quiet town in Pennsylvania called Titusville. Edwin Drake, an unlikely pioneer backed by skeptical investors, struck oil at a depth of just 69 feet. The black liquid that gushed from the earth was far more than just a curiosity. It was the promise of a new age of energy. Initially, its most valued use was as kerosene, replacing whale oil in lamps and lighting up homes across the industrializing world. This was already transformative. No longer did cities depend on the dangerous and dwindling harvest of whale fat for illumination, but kerosene was only the beginning. What was not yet clear in those early years was that oil would soon power not only light, but motion. As the 19th century waned and the 20th approached, the internal combustion engine emerged as a technology hungry for fuel, and crude oil answered the call perfectly. Gasoline, a byproduct once considered waste, became the bloodline of automobiles, trucks, ships, and eventually aircraft. Where gold had been a measure of wealth, oil became the enabler of industrial action. Gold sat in vaults, silent and inert. Oil, on the other hand, roared through pistons, turned propellers, and powered an entirely new kind of world economy. The implications of this shift were vast and far-reaching. Nations with rich oil fields found themselves vaulted into unprecedented geopolitical importance. The deserts of the Middle East, once considered barren and peripheral to the world's great power struggles, became central to them. In Russia, Venezuela, and parts of Africa, oil became both a blessing and a curse, bringing immense revenue but also making these nations pawns in the strategic games of global powers. And while gold still glittered in treasuries, oil began to dictate the pace of modern warfare, industrial capacity, and even the stability of entire economies.
Consider the First World War. Coal still held a strong position, but oil-powered ships and vehicles began to show their decisive advantages. By the Second World War, oil was no longer a secondary fuel. It was the prize. The German drive toward the Caucasus, Japan's push into Southeast Asia, the Allied defense of Middle Eastern oil fields, all were shaped by the reality that without oil, armies could not move, planes could not fly, and factories could not produce. Oil had become the real gold of the modern age, though far less stable in price and far more volatile in politics. And here is where the story takes on a deeply human element. Gold had always inspired romance, a kind of timeless lust for beauty and permanence. Oil, by contrast, inspired urgency. It could not be hoarded in the same way. It had to flow. Pipelines, tankers, refineries, the entire infrastructure was in motion. And with that motion came constant vulnerability. A war could disrupt shipping lanes. A political coup could shut off supply from an entire region. A single well placed in the wrong hands could shift balances of power. Oil wealth was liquid in every sense. Liquid in form, and liquid in how quickly it could change hands or disappear. This liquidity reshaped the way money moved. Petrodollars became a term in the mid-20th century, describing how oil revenues flowed back into the global banking system, often recycling into the very nations that consumed the most. The United States, with its growing consumption and powerful navy, positioned itself as both the largest buyer and a key protector of oil flows. The link between oil and the US dollar became a kind of modern gold standard, not officially, but in effect. Nations needed dollars to buy oil, which meant the dollar's value became tethered not just to America's economy, but to the entire oil trade.
Oil also introduced a new kind of economic fragility. While gold's value could fluctuate, it was relatively immune to the sudden shocks that oil prices could inflict. The oil crises of the 1970s demonstrated this with brutal clarity. Embargoes, political instability, and production cuts sent prices soaring, plunging importing nations into recessions. The flow of crude became a choke point for the global economy, and everyone from small business owners to heads of state learned that the world now ran on a resource that could be both abundant and scarce in the blink of an eye. And yet, despite this volatility, oil powered a century of extraordinary growth. Highways stretched across continents. Cargo ships connected distant ports. Air travel shrunk the globe into something that felt navigable, even small. The very shape of cities, sprawling suburbs built around car ownership, was molded by oil's abundance. Gold had once allowed for expansion by stabilizing trade, but oil allowed for expansion by enabling physical movement on a scale humanity had never known. Imagine, for a moment, living in the early 20th century. You might still see gold coins in circulation, feel their weight in your palm, but more and more, you would also see cars replacing horse-drawn carriages, trucks replacing rail for certain routes, and ships that could sail farther and faster without coal stops. You might not consciously think of oil as the driver of this change, but you would feel its effects everywhere. In the goods arriving faster, in the lights staying on longer, and in the growing hum of machines in every corner of life. The black blood of industry had begun to pump through the veins of the global economy, and there was no turning back. Gold still glittered, but its role as the unquestioned king of wealth had been challenged. Oil didn't need to replace gold in vaults to replace it in importance. It replaced it in urgency, in strategic value, and in the raw power it conferred on those who controlled its flow. And in the decades to come, this new form of wealth would not only drive economies, but would dictate alliances, fuel conflicts, and quietly define the contours of the modern world. From here, our journey moves into the next stage, the way oil's rise began to intertwine with the very currency systems that once revolved around gold. For if gold had been the anchor of money, oil was about to become its tide, pulling and pushing economies with each swell in its value. By the time the Second World War had ended, the world had witnessed the collapse of empires, the redrawing of borders, and the near total restructuring of its economic foundations. Gold still glittered in the vaults of central banks, but its supremacy as the anchor of international wealth was beginning to show cracks. The American dollar had risen to a position of global dominance, backed by the massive gold reserves at Fort Knox and by the sheer industrial might of the United States. For a brief moment, it seemed that gold and the dollar were intertwined in an unbreakable embrace, but the seeds of a new era had already been planted in the soil of the Arabian Peninsula and other oil-rich regions, seeds that would grow into something far more powerful than any single metal could ever hope to be. To understand the birth of the petrodollar, imagine the dusty expanse of the Saudi desert in the early 20th century. The land was harsh and unforgiving, dotted with small settlements, oases, and ancient caravan routes that had carried frankincense, myrrh, and spices long before the age of empires. Beneath this seemingly barren landscape lay oceans of crude oil, thick, black, and unimaginably valuable, though at that time it was worth little to the tribes who lived above it. Oil needed the world, and the world needed oil, but the link between the two was yet to be forged. In 1933, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia signed a concession agreement with Standard Oil of California, granting them rights to explore for oil in exchange for annual payments. It was a modest deal at first, but in 1938, when oil was finally discovered in commercial quantities in Dammam Well No. 7, everything changed. This discovery came just as the world was preparing for war, a war in which oil would become as vital as bullets and steel. The 1973 oil crisis provided the perfect backdrop for the next great transformation of wealth. When the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, declared an oil embargo in response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, the price of oil quadrupled. For oil importing nations, this was an economic earthquake. Lines at gas stations stretched for miles. Inflation soared. The industrialized world realized with stunning clarity that its prosperity depended entirely on the goodwill of oil-producing states. It was in this moment of upheaval that a new economic arrangement took shape, one that would marry the dollar to oil in a way that ensured America's financial dominance for decades to come. In 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia reached a historic agreement. Saudi oil sales would be priced exclusively in U.S. dollars, and in return, the U.S. would provide military protection and advanced weaponry to the kingdom. Other OPEC nations followed suit, and thus the petrodollar system was born. Under this arrangement, any country that wished to buy oil had to first acquire U.S. dollars, effectively creating a constant global demand for the currency. Oil revenues were then recycled back into the American economy, as oil exporters invested their surplus dollars into U.S. government bonds and other assets. This cycle, oil for dollars, dollars for U.S. debt, became the invisible architecture of the global economy. The petrodollar system transformed the dollar into more than just a currency. It became the ticket to energy, the key to keeping lights on and factories running. For America, this was nothing short of genius. Even without gold, the dollar remained the world's reserve currency because the world had no choice but to use it. For oil producers, it provided stability and access to the largest economy in the world. For the rest of the world, it created a dependency that would prove difficult, if not impossible, to break.
But the birth of the petrodollar was not without consequences. Oil's central role in the global economy made it both a prize and a weapon. Nations with abundant oil reserves suddenly found themselves wielding immense geopolitical power. Wars would be fought, coups would be staged, and alliances would be forged, all in the shadow of the oil trade. From the Iranian Revolution of 1979 to the Gulf War of 1991, the world would see again and again how deeply the pursuit of oil wealth could shape history. Imagine being an economist in the 1970s, watching this new system take shape. You would see that while gold had once been the immovable anchor of value, oil had become the new heartbeat of commerce. Gold had been rare, yes, but oil was indispensable. Without oil, ships could not sail, planes could not fly, and modern economies would grind to a halt. And unlike gold, which could be hoarded for decades, oil had to keep flowing to keep the world alive. The petrodollar system also had a calming effect, at least on the surface, for global markets. It created a predictable framework for trade and finance, where the dollar's role as the medium of exchange for the most vital commodity on Earth made it almost unassailable. Yet beneath this calm surface, tensions brewed. What would happen if a major oil producer decided to sell in another currency? What if oil reserves ran low? What if renewable energy made petroleum obsolete? These questions lingered even as the petrodollar's grip tightened. The story of the petrodollar is, in many ways, the story of how oil replaced gold, not just in economic terms, but in the very imagination of wealth. In the 18th century, to control gold was to control empires. In the late 20th century, to control oil was to control the world. The U.S. had managed to position itself at the crossroads of this new reality, ensuring that even without gold, its currency would remain the undisputed king of global finance.
And yet, the petrodollar's rise was not the end of the journey. It was a chapter in a longer story, one that would see challenges from emerging economies, shifts in energy technology, and the slow but steady questioning of the dollar's hegemony. For now, though, the 1970s closed with oil enthroned as the new standard of wealth, and with the dollar still firmly in command. As we leave this chapter, imagine yourself in 1975, standing on the deck of a tanker ship in the Persian Gulf. The air smells faintly of salt and crude oil. Somewhere behind you, in the scorching desert, pipelines snake their way to the coast, carrying the liquid gold of the modern age. Somewhere ahead, across vast oceans, cities wait for the fuel that will power their lights, their machines, their dreams. You can almost hear the hum of the world's heartbeat, and it runs on oil. And so, as the age of gold quietly fades into memory, a new era begins, one in which the measure of wealth is not locked away in vaults, but pumped from the depths of the earth and sold in dollars. This was the moment oil truly replaced gold, and the world would never be the same. Yet history has a way of reminding us that no standard lasts forever. For as dominant as oil and the dollar seemed, new forces were already stirring, ready to challenge their reign in the decades to come.
In the dawn of the 18th century, the hum of spinning wheels, the clatter of iron hammers, and the rhythmic pounding of steam pistons began to replace the slow, wind and water-driven pace of production. The Industrial Revolution was gathering speed, and at the heart of this transformation was coal, a black, gritty substance pulled from the earth in great quantities. For centuries, coal had been known as a humble fuel, used in hearth fires and blacksmith forges, but now it was about to become the beating heart of a new kind of wealth creation, one that would ultimately challenge the supremacy of gold in shaping the world's economic destiny. Coal, abundant yet finite, became the foundation of industrial might, fueling machines, railways, and steamships, and in doing so, redrawing the economic map of the globe. It was not the glitter of gold, but the sooty, utilitarian power of coal that propelled nations into the modern era. In its simplest form, the story of coal's rise is a story about energy. Before coal, economies relied on muscle, human and animal, on wind that could vanish with a calm, and on water whose flow could freeze in winter. These sources were inconsistent, limiting productivity and the scale of commerce. Coal changed that. It burned hotter, longer, and more reliably than wood. It could be mined in vast quantities and transported to where it was needed. Its adoption was a quiet revolution, as the energy locked in its carbon-rich seams unlocked new possibilities in manufacturing, transportation, and military power.
To understand coal's economic impact, picture a textile mill in Manchester around 1820. Rows upon rows of looms clatter as threads are woven into fabric, the noise deafening. The air is thick with cotton dust, and outside, a tall brick chimney belches thick, black smoke into the sky. That smoke is coal's signature, the visible proof of an engine roaring to life inside, driving not just the machinery, but the livelihoods of hundreds of workers. Gold may have been the treasure of kings, but coal was the wealth of nations. It generated not just monetary value, but the capacity for mass production, enabling goods to be made faster, cheaper, and in greater quantity than ever before. Coal's reach went far beyond factory walls. Its power extended to transportation, shrinking the world in ways that gold never could. Steamships fueled by coal crossed oceans in weeks instead of months, carrying goods, passengers, and ideas at unprecedented speeds. Railways stitched together continents, moving raw materials to factories and finished goods to markets with mechanical precision. This expansion of connectivity accelerated global trade, allowing countries to specialize in certain industries while relying on imports for others. Britain, the first nation to fully harness coal's potential, became the workshop of the world, exporting manufactured goods to every corner of the globe. Economically, coal shifted the balance of power between nations. Resource-rich regions could industrialize faster, producing more goods and dominating global markets. Those without coal found themselves at a disadvantage, often relegated to supplying raw materials or agricultural products to industrialized powers. This disparity laid the groundwork for new forms of economic dependency and imperial ambition. Britain's navy, powered by coal-fired steam engines, projected military force across oceans, securing trade routes and colonies that supplied the raw materials needed to feed its factories. The wealth generated by coal production and industrial exports was reinvested into expanding infrastructure, education, and technology, creating a feedback loop of growth that gold alone could never have sustained.
The societal impact of coal was equally profound. Entire towns sprang up around coal mines, their populations swelling with workers drawn by the promise of steady wages. But this prosperity came at a cost. The mining towns were often grim, with cramped housing, poor sanitation, and air thick with soot. Underground, miners faced dangerous conditions. Collapses, gas explosions, and lung diseases were constant threats. The pursuit of coal wealth created stark divides between the owners of the mines and the laborers who toiled in them. This tension fueled early labor movements, demanding safer conditions, fair pay, and reasonable hours. The fight for workers' rights became an inseparable part of the industrial story. Its echoes still heard in economic debates today. Coal also reshaped the natural world. Forests that had been depleted for fuel began to recover, but in their place, vast tracts of land were scarred by mining. Rivers ran black with runoff, and cities under coal's influence developed a haze that dimmed the sun at midday. These environmental changes were largely accepted at the time as the price of progress. After all, coal was powering prosperity on a scale previously unimaginable. But even then, there were voices warning that such dependence on a single energy source carried risks, both in its environmental consequences and in its potential for depletion. Perhaps the most significant economic ripple of coal's dominance was its role in enabling other industries to thrive. Iron and steel production surged, providing the materials for railways, bridges, ships, and buildings. The chemical industry expanded, producing dyes, fertilizers, and eventually synthetic materials. Coal-powered machinery transformed agriculture, mining, and manufacturing alike. The wealth created by these interconnected industries reinforced coal's status as the backbone of modern economies, much as gold had been the backbone of trade in earlier centuries. Imagine, for a moment, standing in a bustling Victorian port. Ships line the docks, their decks piled with crates marked Manchester or Birmingham, filled with goods destined for markets half a world away. The air is a mix of salt, coal smoke, and the smell of fresh timber from shipyards. Every departure and arrival is tied in some way to coal. whether in the fuel that drives the ships or in the factories that produced the goods. Gold may have been the coin in the merchant's pocket, but coal was the unseen currency powering the global economy. The societal impact of coal was equally profound. Entire towns sprang up around coal mines, their populations swelling with workers drawn by the promise of steady wages. But this prosperity came at a cost. The mining towns were often grim, with cramped housing, poor sanitation, and air thick with soot. Underground, miners faced dangerous conditions. Collapses, gas explosions, and lung diseases were constant threats. The pursuit of coal wealth created stark divides between the owners of the mines and the laborers who toiled in them. This tension fueled early labor movements, demanding safer conditions, fair pay, and reasonable hours. The fight for workers' rights became an inseparable part of the industrial story. Its echoes still heard in economic debates today. Coal also reshaped the natural world. Forests that had been depleted for fuel began to recover, but in their place, vast tracts of land were scarred by mining. Rivers ran black with runoff, and cities under coal's influence developed a haze that dimmed the sun at midday. These environmental changes were largely accepted at the time as the price of progress. After all, coal was powering prosperity on a scale previously unimaginable. But even then, there were voices warning that such dependence on a single energy source carried risks, both in its environmental consequences and in its potential for depletion. Perhaps the most significant economic ripple of coal's dominance was its role in enabling other industries to thrive. Iron and steel production surged, providing the materials for railways, bridges, ships, and buildings. The chemical industry expanded, producing dyes, fertilizers, and eventually synthetic materials. Coal-powered machinery transformed agriculture, mining, and manufacturing alike. The wealth created by these interconnected industries reinforced coal's status as the backbone of modern economies, much as gold had been the backbone of trade in earlier centuries. Imagine, for a moment, standing in a bustling Victorian port. Ships line the docks, their decks piled with crates marked Manchester or Birmingham, filled with goods destined for markets half a world away. The air is a mix of salt, coal smoke, and the smell of fresh timber from shipyards. Every departure and arrival is tied in some way to coal, whether in the fuel that drives the ships or in the factories that produced the goods. Gold may have been the coin in the merchant's pocket, but coal was the unseen currency powering the global economy.
This transition would not happen overnight. For decades, coal and oil coexisted, each serving different needs: coal in electricity generation and heavy industry, oil in transportation and military applications. But the writing was on the wall. The mobility, flexibility, and strategic importance of oil would eventually eclipse coal, just as coal had once eclipsed the energy sources before it. Coal's era as the economic engine of the world left a lasting legacy. It proved that a resource, when harnessed effectively, could reshape economies, societies, and geopolitics. It demonstrated that wealth could come not only from precious metals, but from the raw power of energy itself. And it laid the groundwork for the next great transformation in global wealth, the age of oil. And so, as coal's smoke-darkened skies gave way to the glint of oil's black showing, the story of wealth's journey continued to evolve. The world was on the brink of another seismic shift, one that would redefine not only the sources of power, but the very nature of global trade and influence. Yet before oil could rise fully to dominance, it had to find its place among the giants of industry, and prove itself worthy of replacing coal as the fuel of empires.
The year was 1973, and for much of the industrialized world, it began like any other. Cities hummed with the familiar rhythm of factories, highways, and ports. Cars rolled endlessly along asphalt ribbons, their engines purring on a steady diet of gasoline. Oil tankers slipped quietly into harbors, delivering the black liquid that had become as vital as air to the modern economy. But in October of that year, the flow of oil, a resource now far more important to daily life than gold, suddenly slowed, and the world held its breath. To understand the shock of 1973, you have to first see the world through the eyes of that era's leaders. Oil was not just fuel. It was the very foundation of progress. Cities were built to sprawl because cars made commuting possible.
Airlines flew farther and faster, connecting continents like never before. Manufacturing plants ran almost entirely on petroleum-powered machinery. Even the plastics that wrapped food and clothed people in synthetic fabrics were born from oil's alchemy. This was a time when nations measured their strength not only by their armies and gold reserves, but by how much oil they could secure.
The crisis began when members of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, decided to cut oil production and place an embargo on certain nations, most notably the United States and its allies, in response to political events in the Middle East. Overnight, oil prices quadrupled. It was as if the world's heart had skipped a beat. Gasoline lines snaked through neighborhoods, with drivers idling for hours, hoping to fill their tanks before stations ran dry. Industry slowed or shut down entirely. Inflation surged. Economies that had been sprinting forward suddenly stumbled, and the sound of progress dulled to a cautious shuffle. The 1973 oil shock was a turning point in the journey from gold to oil as the currency of power. Where gold's reign had been built on stability, oil's ascendancy carried an element of volatility. Gold could be mined and stored, its supply relatively predictable, but oil was tied to geopolitics, extraction, and the fragile cooperation of nations. A disruption in one part of the world could ripple instantly across the globe. This was the year people realized that oil wasn't just a commodity, it was a political weapon. Imagine being a policymaker in Washington, London, or Tokyo at the time. For decades, energy had been abundant, and planning was a matter of expanding consumption, not managing scarcity. Suddenly, the charts on your desk showed rising prices, shrinking reserves, and the growing possibility of public unrest. Decisions made in distant capitals now determined whether your factories could operate or your citizens could commute. The world had been reminded, violently, that dependence on a single resource was both a blessing and a curse.
The impact was not merely economic. The 1973 oil shock reshaped global politics. It elevated oil-producing nations, particularly in the Middle East, into major players on the world stage. Wealth from petroleum transformed cities like Riyadh and Abu Dhabi almost overnight, financing skyscrapers, highways, and universities. Conversely, oil-importing nations began to reconsider their foreign policies, trade agreements, and energy strategies. Some sought alliances with producing countries, others invested in alternative energy sources, hoping to avoid such vulnerability in the future. For ordinary people, the crisis brought oil's value into sharp, personal focus. It was no longer an invisible resource that arrived at the gas pump without thought. It was something to be rationed, hoarded, even fought over in the political sense. The phrase energy independence entered the public lexicon, and conservation became not just an environmental concern, but an economic necessity. Streetlights dimmed earlier, thermostats were lowered, people traded in large, fuel-hungry cars for smaller, more efficient ones. In households and boardrooms alike, oil had taken on a near-mythic significance, something powerful enough to dictate the pace of daily life. The shock also had a lasting cultural impact. The oil crisis made headlines daily, but it also appeared in art, literature, and film. Stories of scarcity, greed, and the fragility of modern civilization became popular themes. The notion that a single, distant decision could upend life in an entirely different part of the world became a shared anxiety. In many ways, it was the modern equivalent of gold runs in the 19th century, panic sparked not by a lack of precious metal, but by the drying up of a resource more entwined with survival than luxury. Yet, within the disruption lay opportunity. The crisis prompted innovation. Governments and companies began investing more seriously in nuclear power, natural gas, and even early renewable technologies like wind and solar. Though these would take decades to mature, the seeds were planted in the oil-scarred soil of the 1970s. Economists began to think in terms of energy economics, a field that looked beyond money to measure how the availability and cost of energy shaped markets, industries, and even political stability. The oil shock also served as a vivid reminder of the interconnectedness of the global economy. Just as gold once moved across continents in caravans and galleons, oil now flowed through vast, delicate networks of tankers, pipelines, and refineries. And just as a storm could sink a gold-laden ship centuries earlier, a political dispute could now choke off the oil supply, sending shockwaves across oceans. As the decade progressed, the world adjusted. Oil prices eventually stabilized, but the lessons of 1973 lingered. Countries diversified suppliers, strategic petroleum reserves were created, vast underground tanks holding millions of barrels to cushion against future disruptions, and slowly, a quiet understanding settled over the industrialized world. The age of oil, as wealth's new standard, had fully arrived, but it came with risks gold had never posed.
And so, as the dust settled on the oil shock, a new awareness took root. The world had seen how a handful of nations could, quite literally, hold the engine of modern civilization in their hands. The old era, when gold dictated the terms of power, was now a distant memory. Oil had replaced it not only in economic value, but in its ability to shape history in a single stroke. From here, the journey would take us deeper into an age where black gold's influence would intertwine with wars, technology, and the shifting fortunes of nations. The crisis of 1973 was not the end of the story. It was the loud, jarring bell that woke the world to oil's true power. And as the global economy began to hum again, no one could forget the moment it had almost gone silent. From the shadows of this crisis, another chapter emerged, one where the alliances formed and the strategies devised in the mid-1970s would pave the way for new confrontations, fresh booms, and unforeseen busts in the decades to come. The next turn in our journey would show that while oil had taken gold's crown, the throne itself was less stable than ever.
It is difficult, from our modern vantage point, to imagine a world without the smell of oil, whether drifting from a dockside where barrels are stacked like fortifications, or wafting through the narrow streets of a growing industrial city. And yet there was a time when the vast majority of humanity had no awareness of the sticky, black liquid buried beneath their feet. They lived and died in worlds powered by wind, muscle, water, and wood. The first great oil booms were not merely an energy story. They were a reordering of global wealth, a rewriting of political alliances, and a subtle but profound reshaping of what nations valued. The story begins in the mid-19th century, with isolated drilling sites in Pennsylvania, the Caucasus, and the shores of the Caspian Sea. At first, oil was not sought for fueling machines, but for lighting homes. Whale oil was expensive, and candles were dim. The refining of petroleum into kerosene offered a new possibility: cleaner, brighter, and more affordable illumination. This singular shift brought oil into the consciousness of traders, engineers, and financiers. Wells that once seemed local curiosities became magnets for investment, and within a generation, the oil industry had birthed a new class of millionaires. But oil was unlike gold in an important way. It did not simply sit in a vault, inert and eternal. Oil was consumed, burned, transformed into energy. It had to be constantly extracted and replenished. The nature of wealth began to bend towards something more dynamic, more dependent on technology and logistics. The pipelines that snaked across fields, the rail cars loaded with barrels, the refineries belching steam. These were not merely infrastructure, they were the arteries of a new economic organism.
Consider the town of Baku in the late 1800s. Its dusty outskirts sprouted forests of derricks, each creaking as it drew the Earth's ancient liquefied past toward the surface. Here, fortunes were made not through the slow accumulation of centuries-old coins, but in the feverish months of a successful strike. Entrepreneurs like the Nobel brothers, yes, the same family behind the Nobel Prizes, transformed oil extraction and refining into industrial art. Tanker ships began to appear, carrying this new wealth from the Caspian to faraway ports. The same pattern emerged in the United States, where John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil perfected the art of controlling every step from wellhead to market shelf. The implications were staggering. Energy no longer came only from the wind in sails or the coal in a furnace. It could be stored, moved, and sold as a liquid. Cities could light their streets and homes without relying on expensive imports. Factories could operate more cheaply, extending their working hours and multiplying their output. And while the early oil booms were still rooted in lighting, they hinted at something larger: the possibility of powering transport, industry, and even war in ways gold could never match. This transformation altered political priorities. Control over oil fields became a matter of national interest not just corporate ambition. Governments began to recognize that whoever commanded oil production could shape economies far beyond their own borders. Already, subtle geopolitical dances were taking place. Britain's interest in Middle Eastern drilling rights, Russia's tight grip on the Caucasus wells, America's rapid industrialization fueled by domestic crude.
For the ordinary worker, oil's arrival meant new kinds of labor, jobs in drilling, refining, and transport that were far removed from the pastoral or artisanal worlds their grandparents had known. Towns sprung up overnight near oil strikes, sometimes vanishing just as quickly when the wells ran dry. In these communities, the rhythm of life was tied not to the seasons, but to the global price of crude. A sudden market glut could plunge thousands into poverty. A spike in demand could send wages soaring. The volatility of oil wealth was both a promise and a threat. And yet, amid the rush, there was a quiet revolution taking place in the collective imagination. Gold had been the archetype of wealth for millennia, its gleam symbolizing permanence and security. Oil, by contrast, was a darker wealth, hidden, volatile, combustible. To possess it was to wield power that could vanish as quickly as it came. It was a reminder that the engines of modern prosperity required constant feeding, that wealth was no longer a static hoard, but a flowing current. Imagine standing in an oil field in 1870, watching a gusher erupt for the first time. The ground shakes, a plume of black liquid arcs into the air, and the crowd erupts into cheers and shouts. There is an electric sense that something has been unlocked, an awareness that this substance will change everything. But no one in that moment can fully grasp how deep those changes will run.
As the oil booms intensified, so too did the competition. Small producers were swallowed by larger conglomerates, foreign capital poured into drilling regions, and nations began to sketch maps not around rivers and mountains, but around reserves and transit routes. The modern age of resource geopolitics was dawning, and with it, a growing awareness that the rules of the gold standard world were slowly being rewritten. And so, while oil had not yet toppled gold from its symbolic throne, the foundations were shifting. In the glow of kerosene lamps and the hiss of refinery steam, the first whispers of a new economic order could be heard, one in which wealth was not measured solely by the metal in a treasury, but by the flow of a resource that could power the world into a new century. From here, the story would accelerate. Oil would leap from the role of illumination to the role of locomotion, fueling engines, ships, and eventually aircraft. It would become the invisible lifeblood of modern economies. But in these early booms, when the world first learned to crave its benefits, the stage was set for the moment when oil would not merely rival gold, but replace it as the measure of global power. And with that, we turn toward the rise of mechanized transport, an evolution that would bind oil to the very movement of people and goods, making it not just a commodity, but a necessity without which modern life could not function.
When the world staggered in the wake of oil shocks and currency turmoil in the early 1970s, a quiet agreement between two very different powers would redraw the map of global wealth for decades to come. The United States, emerging from the shadow of the gold standard's collapse, found itself holding a currency that now floated freely, its value no longer backed by gleaming metal, but by trust and perception. Across the ocean, Saudi Arabia sat upon seemingly endless reserves of black gold, their oil fields pumping wealth at a rate no ancient empire could have imagined. What united them was necessity. America needed a way to secure oil for its energy-hungry economy, and the Saudis needed a stable and profitable way to sell their vast supply. To understand how monumental this shift was, we need to rewind a little. For most of recorded history, the great currencies of the world had been tethered to physical commodities, gold, silver, copper, anchoring value to something tangible. When Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, the dollar's tie to gold was severed, creating a problem. What would keep the dollar valuable in the eyes of the world? Without gold's promise, it could have slid into distrust, becoming just another piece of paper in a competitive marketplace of currencies. But in the shadows of diplomacy, another form of backing was taking shape, not with a precious metal, but with the very resource that powered factories, cars, ships, and planes.
The petrodollar system was deceptively simple. The United States struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, the largest oil exporter at the time. Saudi oil would be priced and sold exclusively in US dollars, regardless of the buyer's nationality. In return, the US would provide military protection, arms deals, and political support to the Saudi monarchy. Within a few years, other members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, adopted the same practice, making the dollar the unquestioned medium for global oil transactions. Now, if a nation wanted oil, whether it was France, Japan, or Brazil, it first had to acquire US dollars. This created a constant global demand for the American currency, locking it into a role even more powerful than gold had once been. Imagine for a moment the quiet brilliance of this system. Instead of vaults of gold bars in Fort Knox, America now had barrels of oil across the world acting as de facto reserves for its currency. Every oil importing country effectively became a customer for US dollars. And because oil was the lifeblood of modern economies, that demand was inescapable. The global financial system became a vast circulatory network, with the dollar as its heart and oil as its oxygen. The more the world developed, building highways, fueling industries, expanding trade, the more it needed oil, and by extension, more dollars. The implications were profound. The U.S. could now finance deficits, wars, and domestic programs by printing the very currency the world required to buy energy. Treasury bonds found eager buyers among oil-rich nations seeking a safe place to invest their surpluses, creating a feedback loop that kept interest rates manageable and the dollar strong. The petrodollar arrangement also cemented geopolitical alliances. American military presence in the Middle East deepened, ensuring stability in the oil trade routes and securing U.S. influence in a volatile region. But the petrodollar wasn't just about economics, it was about power projection. It allowed the United States to wield sanctions as a weapon, cutting off nations from the dollar-based oil market and thereby starving their economies. Countries that resisted, such as Iraq under Saddam Hussein or Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, often found themselves under intense political and military pressure, particularly when they hinted at selling oil in other currencies. This monopoly over the pricing of the world's most vital commodity became a silent empire, less visible than the British Navy's control of the seas in the 19th century, but perhaps even more pervasive. For oil-producing nations, the system brought both stability and dependency. On one hand, pricing oil in dollars gave them a reliable, liquid market with minimal currency risk. On the other, it tied their fortunes to the fate of a foreign currency they couldn't control. Petrodollar earnings had to be reinvested somewhere, and American banks, bonds, and markets became the default destinations. The wealth of oil-rich states flowed back into the U.S. financial system, further strengthening its global dominance. By the late 20th century, the petrodollar system had become so embedded in the world economy that few questioned its mechanics. Just as in earlier centuries, no one questioned why gold was the measure of value. Yet, beneath the calm surface, shifts were already stirring. Energy diversification, renewable technologies, and geopolitical rivalries would eventually test the system's durability. Still, for nearly half a century, the petrodollar arrangement stood as one of the most consequential economic architectures ever devised, replacing gold as the anchor of global wealth with the liquid power of oil. Picture yourself in the 1970s, a merchant not of spices or silks, but of energy contracts and tanker routes. The gold coins of old have been replaced by wire transfers and green paper backed by oil fields half a world away. The bazaars are now stock exchanges, the caravans are oil tankers, and the currency in your ledger is no longer tied to what you can weigh, but to what you can burn. This was the moment when oil didn't just fuel engines, it fueled the supremacy of a currency, and in doing so, rewrote the story of wealth's journey. And yet, like all systems in history, the petrodollar is not immune to the tides of change. As we move forward, new forces, technological, political, environmental, begin to challenge its reign, hinting at another transformation on the horizon.
In the summer of 1944, as the Second World War still raged, but its outcome seemed increasingly clear, a quiet gathering took place in the small town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Representatives from 44 nations, weary of war and hungry for a more stable economic future, met in the elegant halls of the Mount Washington Hotel. The air outside was filled with the scent of pine and the hum of summer insects. Yet inside those rooms, history was being shaped in the language of currencies, reserves, and trade balances. For gold, this was not quite the end, but it was the beginning of its final formal role in the global monetary order. The idea was deceptively simple: to create a post-war system that would anchor international trade to something both stable and universally trusted. Gold had been the go-to anchor for centuries, but the United States now held the vast majority of the world's gold reserves, 3/4 of it, in fact, thanks to the war and its earlier economic rise. This gave the U.S. a unique advantage. And so the Bretton Woods Agreement pegged other countries' currencies to the dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. It was a hybrid system, a gold standard with an American face.
This arrangement seemed elegant in theory. Nations could exchange their currencies for U.S. dollars, and, if necessary, dollars could be redeemed for gold. Stability was the promise, predictability was the goal. In practice, it meant the U.S. dollar became the beating heart of the global economy, while gold served as the skeleton holding everything upright. A French importer could sell wine to a Canadian buyer, be paid in Canadian dollars, convert them into U.S. dollars, and, if they wished, claim the equivalent in gold. The golden thread still ran through the tapestry of world trade, but it was now stitched tightly to American currency. The implications were vast. The system gave countries the confidence to rebuild after the war, knowing their currencies were tied to something of real value. Trade flourished in the 1950s and 1960s, creating what some economists call the golden age of post-war growth. Factories roared back to life, ships crossed the oceans laden with goods, and the world seemed to rediscover prosperity. Yet beneath this calm surface, tension was already brewing. For Bretton Woods to work, the United States had to maintain the gold-to-dollar link at all costs. This required careful balance, enough dollars in circulation to grease the wheels of international trade, but not so many that foreign governments would start redeeming them for gold in quantities the U.S. could not sustain. However, as America's economic commitments grew, financing the Cold War, funding the Marshall Plan, expanding domestic programs, more and more dollars flowed overseas. By the late 1960s, the system was strained to its limits. Imagine being a central banker in Paris in 1968. You hold billions in U.S. dollars, each theoretically convertible into gold at $35 per ounce. But you begin to suspect that the U.S. Treasury's gold vault at Fort Knox is not nearly full enough to cover all the dollars floating around the world. The temptation grows. Why not exchange those dollars for gold now, before the others do? France, under President Charles de Gaulle, did exactly that, sending warships to New York Harbor to collect the gold. This was not merely a financial maneuver, it was a geopolitical statement, a challenge to the U.S.-centered order. The cracks widened. As more nations sought to trade in their dollars for gold, the U.S. found itself in an impossible position. The gold reserves dwindled, confidence wavered, and the idea of gold as the ultimate guarantee of wealth began to falter. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon made a televised announcement that sent shockwaves through the economic world. The U.S. would no longer redeem dollars for gold. It was called the Nixon shock, and with it, the Bretton Woods system effectively ended. For gold, this was a bittersweet farewell. No longer the official backbone of global trade, it returned to being a commodity, still valuable, still desired, but stripped of its wool as the world's monetary ruler. The dollar, unshackled from gold, floated freely against other currencies, and the modern era of fiat money was born. Oil, increasingly essential to the world's machinery, began its rise to dominance, but that story was only just beginning. And yet, the memory of Bretton Woods lingers like the echo of a bell long after it has stopped ringing. It was the last grand attempt to tether the world's wealth to something tangible, a bridge between the glittering certainty of gold and the fluid, often unpredictable nature of modern finance. From this point on, wealth's journey would follow a new course, one in which oil, black, liquid, and drawn from the depths of the earth, would replace the bright, immutable metal as the measure of power. The age of gold had given way to the age of energy. And so, as we leave the pine-covered hills of New Hampshire and step into the roaring oil fields of the 20th century, the story shifts. Not from one precious resource to another, but from a symbol of enduring value to a force that powered the very heartbeat of modern civilization. In the years after the Second World War, the map of wealth shifted again, not with the slow grace of centuries, as it had in the age of gold, but with the sudden force of a political deal, a handful of signatures, and the quiet yet immense hum of oil tankers leaving distant ports. The U.S. dollar, which had already emerged from the war as a symbol of American industrial strength, now took on a role that no currency had ever played so dominantly. It became the key to buying the world's most important resource. The story of the petrodollar system is not only the story of money and oil, but of how one nation's currency came to dictate the flow of global trade, shape geopolitics, and anchor a financial order that still lingers today. To understand how this happened, imagine standing on a hot tarmac in Saudi Arabia in the early 1970s. In the distance, the desert shimmers. Behind the palace walls, American officials and Saudi royals sit in cool rooms, their conversations guarded but decisive. Oil prices are rising, economies are trembling, and the United States has just severed the link between its dollar and gold. This left the world's currencies floating freely, but floating without an anchor can lead to chaos. What was needed was a new foundation, a new reason for nations to hold and trust U.S. dollars. That foundation would be oil.
Oil, by then, had already replaced gold as the practical measure of modern power. It fueled cars, powered planes, ran factories, and kept the lights on in cities across every continent. Without it, armies stalled, economies shrank, and political stability cracked. The 1973 oil crisis had just proven how vulnerable the world was to disruptions in supply, and so America struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, to price all its oil sales exclusively in U.S. dollars. In exchange, the U.S. would provide military protection, technological assistance, and political support. Soon, other members of OPEC followed suit. From that moment on, if you were Germany, Japan, or Brazil and you needed oil, you first needed dollars. This meant holding large reserves of U.S. currency, keeping demand for the dollar high, and giving the U.S. extraordinary leverage over global finance. The petrodollar became more than just a payment system. It was a quiet agreement that bound much of the world's economic life to the American financial system. The implications were vast. Oil exporters would receive a flood of dollars, which they often reinvested back into U.S. assets, from treasury bonds to real estate, creating a cycle that strengthened American financial dominance. Countries dependent on oil imports found themselves not just buying fuel, but indirectly participating in the U.S. economic sphere. And for Washington, this meant that sanctions, currency controls, and trade policies could be wielded with far greater impact because so much of global commerce had to pass through the dollar system.
Yet the petrodollar system also deepened global inequalities. Nations with few oil reserves often had to borrow dollars at high interest rates to meet their energy needs, trapping them in cycles of debt. Meanwhile, oil-rich states enjoyed sudden wealth, but often without the economic diversification to sustain it once oil prices fell. The system tied the fate of many economies to both the stability of oil prices and the policies of the U.S. Federal Reserve. By the 1980s and 1990s, the petrodollar was so entrenched that it seemed untouchable. Even major economic powers accepted it as a given. Oil contracts were settled in dollars, central banks kept dollars as their primary reserve, and international trade flowed through U.S.-controlled financial channels. The dollar had become, in effect, the oil standard, as gold had once been the gold standard. Still, history shows that no standard lasts forever. Just as gold eventually gave way to oil, whispers began in the early 21st century about whether oil might one day give way to something else, perhaps another currency, or even a digital system beyond the control of any single nation. But for now, the petrodollar remains a quiet, powerful truth behind global markets. Imagine being an oil trader in the 1980s, sitting in an office overlooking the New York skyline. Every phone call, every contract, every price you quote, it's all in US dollars. You were part of a system so vast that it feels invisible, yet so precise that it shapes the rhythm of every tanker crossing the oceans. This was the crown of the dollar, forged not in gold, but in barrels of oil. To understand why oil would eventually dethrone gold, one must picture the world at the turn of the 20th century. Railroads had already stitched continents together. Steamships had shrunk oceans. But the age of coal was beginning to lose its edge. The internal combustion engine, a marvel of engineering, had begun its quiet revolution. First in cars, then in trucks, and soon in airplanes, it proved one undeniable fact. Whoever controlled oil controlled speed. And whoever controlled speed controlled commerce, warfare, and ultimately global influence. Oil was more than just a source of fuel. It was liquid energy. Unlike coal, it was easier to transport, burned cleaner, and produced more power for its weight. The first great oil booms, most famously in Pennsylvania, Texas, and the Caucasus, were local stories at first. But as the First World War approached, oil transformed into a matter of national strategy. The British Navy, under the leadership of Winston Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty, made a critical and controversial decision to switch its fleet from coal to oil. This meant that Britain would no longer rely solely on domestic coal mines. It meant reaching out, sometimes diplomatically, often aggressively, to secure foreign oil supplies. Persia, modern-day Iran, became a focal point. The British invested heavily in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, ensuring the Royal Navy's lifeblood would be safeguarded. The First World War proved the strategic dominance of oil. Armies that could keep their tanks, trucks, and planes running could outmaneuver enemies still bound by older logistics. After the war, oil became inseparable from the concept of modern military readiness. The United States, blessed with vast reserves, emerged as a growing oil giant. But it wasn't until the Second World War that the true scale of oil's importance was revealed.
Germany's military campaigns were, in many ways, dictated by the pursuit of oil. The Wehrmacht's drive toward the Caucasus in 1942 was fueled by the desperate need to secure the oil fields of Baku. Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor was, in part, a reaction to U.S. embargoes on oil exports to the empire, strangling its war machine. Meanwhile, the Allies, particularly the U.S. and the Soviet Union, were able to sustain massive mechanized forces thanks to their access to immense oil supplies. Victory in World War II was as much about factories and soldiers as it was about pipelines and refineries. After the war, the world economy was rebuilt on an oil-based foundation. The U.S. dollar, backed by gold under the Bretton Woods system, remained the nominal measure of wealth. But in practice, oil began to dictate the flows of global trade. The Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, found themselves sitting atop vast, easily extractable reserves. The discovery of oil in the Middle East shifted the global economic map as dramatically as the discovery of gold in California had done a century earlier. By the 1970s, the connection between oil and monetary power became explicit. The U.S., facing inflation and economic strain, abandoned the gold standard in 1971 under President Richard Nixon. The dollar was no longer redeemable in gold, but its strength was soon tied to oil through the creation of the petrodollar system. Agreements with Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members ensured that oil would be priced in U.S. dollars worldwide. This meant that any nation wishing to buy oil needed U.S. currency, creating a perpetual demand for the dollar and cementing America's financial dominance without the need for gold reserves. The oil crises of 1973 and 1979 revealed the fragility and volatility of this new reality. When OPEC restricted supply, prices skyrocketed, economies trembled, and inflation surged. Oil had become the heartbeat of industrial civilization,
its price fluctuations could bring prosperity or ruin. Unlike gold, which had always been a store of value rather than an engine of productivity, oil was directly linked to the functioning of everyday life. Electricity generation, transportation, manufacturing, and even agriculture all depended on it. Yet oil's reign came with shadows. Wars were fought in its name, from the Iran-Iraq War to the Gulf War. Coups and interventions were justified under the banner of securing energy interests. Environmental degradation and climate change began to emerge as unintended consequences of an oil-dependent world. Still, for over a century, oil has been the hidden standard, the invisible currency that dictates the pace of industry and the reach of empires. Imagine being a merchant in ancient Lydia, your hands running through a pouch of gold coins, each stamped with the king's seal. Now, imagine a modern equivalent, a nation's treasury not in glittering vaults, but in sprawling oil fields, pipelines stretching like metallic rivers across deserts and seas. Gold may have once been the symbol of wealth, but oil became the blood that kept the modern world alive. And yet, as powerful as oil has been, its dominance is not eternal. The seeds of change are already planted in renewable energy, in digital economies, in the slow but steady shift away from fossil fuels. Just as gold once gave way to oil, oil too will someday yield its throne. From here, the story turns toward the next chapter of wealth, one not dug from the earth, but born from the wind, sun, and even the invisible currents of data itself. For while oil replaced gold as the measure of power in the 20th century, the 21st may crown something entirely different.
Imagine standing at the edge of a vast, sun-drenched harbor. The wooden hulls of medieval merchant ships creak as they rock gently in the tide. Sailors chant as they load spices, silk, and grain, and the air smells of salt, sweat, and coin. Centuries later, imagine the same harbor transformed. Steel oil tankers replace wooden vessels, their immense hulls brimming with black gold, engines thrumming softly as cranes lift barrels destined for distant refineries. The rhythm of trade has changed, but the story remains. Human civilizations have always been driven by the pursuit, control, and movement of resources. To trace the journey from gold to oil is to observe the heartbeat of human progress. Gold once symbolized absolute, tangible wealth. Its rarity, luster, and permanence made it the ideal anchor for empires. Caravans crossed deserts, galleons traversed oceans, and empires rose and fell based on their ability to acquire and safeguard it. Think of the mighty Roman Empire, whose coffers overflowed with coins minted from conquered lands, or the Lydians, whose early coins laid the foundation for a monetary system that would ripple across Europe and Asia. Gold's influence was not just financial, it was cultural, political, and spiritual, a symbol of power that demanded respect and inspired awe. Yet, as history unfolded, the stability of gold met the unpredictability of human ambition. Wars, trade imbalances, and discoveries elsewhere created a dynamic in which wealth could no longer be solely measured in metal. Empires experimented with paper currencies, banking systems, and credit networks, each innovation a stepping stone toward a more fluid conception of money. By the time the Industrial Revolution arrived, humanity had already learned that resources were more than objects. They were instruments of transformation. They could fuel factories, armies, and cities, and their scarcity or abundance could dictate the rise and fall of nations.
Oil, emerging from the depths of the earth in the 19th century, offered exactly this transformative power. Unlike gold, which could be hoarded and stored, oil was dynamic. It flowed, burned, powered engines, and kept the industrial world alive. The Pennsylvania oil fields, Baku's derricks, and later Saudi Arabia's vast reserves created not only wealth, but influence. Oil was a resource that connected geography, technology, and politics in unprecedented ways. Control of oil meant not just economic advantage, but the capacity to project power across continents, to fuel armies, and to sustain the infrastructure of modern life. The interplay of trade, conflict, and economic transformation is evident at every stage of this journey. Consider the two world wars.
They were fought not only over territory, but also over access to energy resources. Armies without fuel were immobilized. Industrial centers without coal or oil stalled. An entire nation's fates hinged on their resource security. The post-war arrangements, Bretton Woods, the petrodollar system, and oil alliances, were responses to these lessons, deliberate efforts to stabilize and control the flow of wealth in a world that now moved at unprecedented speed. Yet, despite the complexity of these systems, the narrative remains deeply human. Behind every barrel of oil, every coin of gold, there were merchants, explorers, engineers, and leaders making decisions under uncertainty. They negotiated, fought, and innovated, shaping markets, alliances, and civilizations. Imagine the strategic calculations of a Saudi minister negotiating with U.S. diplomats, or the French central banker questioning whether to exchange dollars for gold in the late 1960s. These moments of human agency reveal that resources are only as powerful as the people who wield them, and that economic history is as much about psychology and foresight as it is about geology or metallurgy.
As oil replaced gold, the world learned new lessons. Wealth was no longer inert, it had to circulate. Economies depended not only on what was held in treasuries, but on what moved through pipelines, refineries, and markets. Political power was intertwined with resource control. Social structures shifted as nations adapted to the demands of mechanization, transportation, and globalized trade. Even cultural norms changed. Consumer expectations, urban planning, and technological adoption were all influenced by the availability and price of energy. In short, resources shaped society in every dimension, quietly dictating possibilities and limitations. Yet, the story does not end with oil. The early 21st century has seen the emergence of new forms of wealth, digital currencies, intellectual property, rare earth minerals, and renewable energy. These resources, while less tangible than gold or oil, wield similar influence. They drive trade, dictate alliances, and create new hierarchies of power. Consider lithium and cobalt, essential for batteries that power the devices and vehicles of our era. Nations with access to these minerals now occupy a strategic position reminiscent of oil-rich countries in the 20th century. Technology, innovation, and access have become as crucial as physical resources, underscoring a timeless truth. Wealth, in all its forms, is fluid and contingent. This reflection brings us to a calm, contemplative pause. Imagine standing once again at the harbor, watching the cargo of the modern age being loaded onto ships. Solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicle batteries, digital servers. The essence of trade remains the same as it did in ancient marketplaces. The movement of valuable goods, the negotiation of exchange, the alignment of human ambition with natural resources. What has changed is the form, the scale, and the velocity. Gold may now sit in museum vaults, oil may fuel the global economy, and digital assets may guide future fortunes, but all are threads in the same human tapestry.